This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. The show starts with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode with Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts as they discuss the various types of catfish in Kansas. K-State's Sandy Johnson, Augustine Obour, and John Holman continue the show as they chat about cover crop options for producers and how the forage can be used for livestock. Mike Brouk, K-State dairy specialist, ends the show as he looks at how the dairy industry has evolved from localized, labor-intensive family homesteads with a single dairy cow into a high-tech, data-driven sector. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken as they discuss catfish on their recent episode.
What catfish do we have in Kansas?
Yeah, we have 12 different species of catfish in Kansas, and the big ones that we think about most of the time are channel catfish. That's the state fish of Kansas, so that one comes to mind. Flathead catfish and blue catfish. Those are probably the big three that most people know about.
Okay.
There's bullhead catfish in there as well, and so there's 3 different species there. And then we have a bunch of really small catfish that are in the 3 to 5 inch size, so kind of that minnow size for most non-science folks. They're called Mad Toms is the main name for them. Stone cats is one of the groups, but most of them are different kind of Mad Toms. So 12 different species we have in Kansas. Quite a bit of diversity, more than most people would realize.
So where do we find catfish?
Well, if we think about going out and fishing for them, a lot of people are going to the reservoirs that we have around the state. So there's lots of abilities to go out. Milford, a lot of people go. That's right down the road from us here at Kansas State. A lot of people go out there. Those big reservoirs. Milford's known for piebald catfish, and so really high densities of those fish. Not really sure why, but that's a unique little fun fact. Found in reservoirs, they're found in natural lakes that occur throughout the U.S., rivers, streams. They're really a ubiquitous group of fish that live almost everywhere. Most of the habitats in those larger locations are going to be, they're going to like to be near the bottom, and they're generally going to like structure. So think about finding a big rock pile or a big log jam. A lot of these catfish are going to be ambush predators, and so they're going to hang out kind of in those areas and wait for something to go by, and then they'll nibble on it. So found pretty much everywhere. They like to be near structure.
What about like when the blue cats are suspended and hanging out in the sort of the center of the water column? Well, what's going on there?
Well, there's a few different things. They can chase different temperatures of water. That can be one of the things they like to see. You see that in big reservoirs sometimes because the really deep areas become anoxic, so there's no oxygen down there for them, so they get forced up to an area where they can breathe. A lot of other times they're chasing fish, right? And so they want to be near a school of shad or wait for shad to come by, or they're near currents where food can go by them. So lots of different reasons that they can be suspended. A lot of it can be time of year too, so you can see them chasing different temperatures or moving up and down in that water column throughout the year.
What do catfish eat, Joe?
Yeah, that depends on the type of catfish, and so a lot of the fish are opportunistic, and so we tend to think about catfish, only wanting to eat fish, and that's true for one or two of the species we'll talk about, but for the most part, they'll eat all kinds of stuff. And so, channel catfish, when they're little, are going to be eating things like crayfish or invertebrates. When they start to get bigger, they're going to switch over and eat some fish. But channel catfish especially are very omnivorous. So they'll eat berries. They'll eat mulberries that fall into the water. We've talked about that before. Most of them are really they're going to be opportunistic and eat whatever comes by. They're really good at sensing chemicals, and so anything that might put out an odor or a taste type thing, they're going to be attracted to.
What sets channel catfish apart from the other species?
Yeah, channel catfish are probably the catfish that most people are familiar with. And so channel catfish are the state fish of Kansas. That happened, about 15 years ago, I think it was recognized. The reason it's the state fish is, one, people love to fish for it, right? So that it's popular. But also in the 50s, Kansas fish farmers were really important at figuring out how to raise catfish. And so for a period of time, Kansas was really the leading area as far as aquaculture for catfish. They figured out how to do it on a large scale. Now a lot of that production has moved south, so we developed a lot of that over time, and so it has a strong history of being an important fish in Kansas, and now people really like to fish for it.
What's interesting or what's distinctive about flatheads?
Yeah. So, flatheads can get a lot bigger than channel catfish. Yeah. And so, some of the other things, they're distinctive. They have a really big underbite. So if you look at them, they kind of have this big underbite that comes out, but they're almost exclusively piscivorous. And so piscivorous means that they're going to eat fish. And so greater than 90% of their diet is derived from fish.
What about blue cats?
Yeah, blue cats, I tend to think of that kind of as like the cream of the crop. I think blue cat's hard to beat on the table for one, they taste really good. But blue catfish they prefer live bait or fresh cut bait. They really like fresh cut bait if you can catch that and cut it up. They're a predator fish. They're still eating a lot of fish, but their rate isn't as high as it is for those flatheads. So those flatheads are eating about 90% of their diet as fish. That drops down depending on where you're at for the blue catfish. One of the other really big differences for blue catfish is that they can tolerate brackish water. And so water that is a little bit salty, so in areas where the ocean and rivers come together. And out in the Northeast, they're actually considered not a game fish like they are here. They're considered an invasive species. So they're going out there and they're able to eat a lot of food. One of the things that they eat in relatively high abundance are blue crabs out there. And so they've found blue crabs, and that's an important fishery. And so they're just eating a lot of things that we wouldn't want them to. We had a recent episode about invasive species. And when we start thinking about geography, a fish that in one area that can be beneficial can be causing problems somewhere else. So it's something to keep in mind.
So what about bullheads? That's probably of the fish that we talked about, that's the least popular sport fish, I think.
Bullheads are one of those things. You talk to some people and, they want to cuss them because they hate them. And, you talk to other people and they want to cuss because they're so excited to have them around.
Yeah.
And so it really invokes a lot of emotion. Probably 40, 50 years ago, bullheads were really, really popular. And bullheads are smaller catfish. There's actually 3 different species of them. There's black bullhead, yellow bullhead, and brown bullhead. Black and yellow tend to be most common. We don't see the browns as around as much, and the brown are the only ones that aren't native to Kansas, right?
Okay.
And so they're smaller catfish, so they tend to be closer to that 3-pound range. They might be able to get up to 4 pounds, but they're going to be a smaller fish. And they can really reproduce really, really rapidly. Most of the other fish that we talked about, they can't reproduce very well in ponds, and they need really big reservoirs to be able to do that. These bullheads are one of the examples where they can reproduce, and they can reproduce really well and make a lot of offspring really quickly and cause some overpopulation issues in your pond relatively quickly. Within probably 4 or 5 years, you could start to see issues. So you got to be harvesting them. When they get in really high densities, they like to stay at the bottom and they swish their tail back and forth. The flip side is they're really easy to catch. I mean, they'll eat just about anything you throw in the water, and you don't have to wait very long for them. And so a lot of people like them because you can have a whole mess of catfish relatively quickly out of a pond if they're in that pond. But generally speaking, people want them to start. They have good intentions, and then realize that everything is kind of ruined because we've put them in. And so strong emotions both ways with bullhead catfish.
So we've talked about everything on these different species that you've talked about except the mad toms and the stone cats. So tell us about those guys.
Well, the mad toms and stone cats are they're non-game catfish. Mad toms are smaller. Their maximum length is, some of them can maybe get up to 5 inches long or something like that, but most of the time you see a mad tom, it's going to be 3 inches long or so. So quite a bit smaller. Tend to find them more in flowing water, so streams. I've caught some in the Kansas River, and so you can catch them in rivers. Most of the time you see them, it's going to be a smaller stream type species. Kansas has 6 different species of mad toms. One of those is the stone cat, but 6 different species. Just a really cool fish, really cool catfish that most people, if they caught it, would think it's, a baby channel catfish or something like that. But cool to have them around.
What kind of catfish should we have in a pond?
Well, that leaves channel catfish, right? And I think, again, that's, if you just go tell someone you're catfish fishing, maybe it's a little different around us because there's so many people that come into our area to catch blue cats.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I think, or across the U.S., if you tell people you're catching catfish, they're going to think about channel catfish.
Sure.
Channel catfish tend to be smaller, but they can do well in a pond. They're kind of just a bonus fish. I tell people they're not going to help, they're not going to hurt. They're just going to kind of be on their own. They're a little bit of a cleanup crew. But one thing that's really important is if you do have channel catfish tend to like big open pockets. So think about like an old tree that's fallen over and rotted out, and you have kind of that hollow stump, right? Or in the bank, a lot of times the water will eat out like a little cavernous type cave area, right? And so they're going to make nests. And so most of the time, actually, the males guard the nest. But the female is going to lay her eggs, and then the male is going to kind of guard this nest. The offspring of catfish, channel catfish especially, are really dumb. And so one of them is going to go up to a bass, and it's going to get eaten, and then all the other babies with it are going to wonder where that catfish baby went. So they're going to swim over to that bass, and before long, they're all going to get eaten up, I guess is the point. So the recommendation is for every one you take out, you want to put 2 back in.
Once again, that was Kansas State University's Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. If you'd like to listen to the full episode, you can do so by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net, searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on your favorite podcast platform, or you can also navigate to it by going to wildlife.k-state.edu. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing cover crops with K-State Cropping Systems and forage agronomist John Holman, K-State soil scientist Augustine Obour, and K-State beef reproduction specialist Sandy Johnson. John, Augustine, Sandy, I appreciate you all taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having us.
When we're thinking about cover crops, what are some options for growers in Kansas?
So we do have, for Western Kansas, we do have options. Our production system normally has some fallow periods, so there's option to grow these cover crops in the fallow phase of our production system. Either you plant this in the summer after wheat harvest, or you can plant this after corn or sorghum harvest, and this will be in the spring. So you can have spring type cover crops or summer type or winter type cover crops that can be planted in our production system.
And what are some different species that producers may want to choose from or take into consideration?
Sure. I'll follow up just a little bit on what Augustine had talked about. Especially this time of the year, as we think about where we're at, we've got some options right now to plant some warm season forages like sorghum sudan, millet, or we're not that far away from starting to think about even planting a fall crop like a fall rye, triticale, radish, turnip.
So what might be some things people evaluate to decide if they're going to plant a cover crop and which one they would plant?
Well, it may depend on the production goal, right? So if you are looking at this for something to graze, then you want to grow something that is well adapted in our environment that can provide some forage resource. Like John mentioned, we've seen that you grow these grasses are predominantly what is adapted to our environment and produce a lot of more biomass that you can graze. There may be the other option where you want to use it for weed suppression benefits. So if weed management is something that you want to do, you want to have something that can grow, produce more biomass, so be very competitive. So things like for the summer, sorghum sudan, millet will be a very good option. In the fall, planting winter triticale will help provide very good weed suppression for kochia that will come up in the spring. For spring cover crops, we have seen that planting oat and triticale as a mixture tend to produce a little bit more biomass for grazing and also for weed suppression benefits. John will attest to some of these. He's done more cover crops since 2007, and then I joined K-State in 2013, and we worked together to look at this. From our research, we don't recommend growing several multi-species of cover crop mixes. Our recommendation is to plant something. If you want to go to a mixture, should be maximum of 4 species mix. That tend to be where our cutoff is. If you grow cocktails, we're seeing that you may have maybe 2 or 3 species that will be dominant in the cover crop mix. So we don't recommend growing 6, 10 species mix of cover crops.
Yeah, Shelby, let me just follow up a little bit on what Dr. Obour said there. So in our research, what we've looked at multi-species cocktails, but we don't really see the benefit of doing that, either from the improvement in soil health, forage yield, or economic. And actually, it hurts us when we think about economics. And so let me just talk a little bit about that. So, where we really see the benefit in the system is if we grow a cover crop that produces a lot of biomass. And so the grass species tend to produce a lot of biomass. And the more biomass we grow, that's the more forage we can utilize. Hence, that translates to more dollars per acre. The broadleaves, they can have a little bit higher quality nutrient value, but the grasses at the time that we're grazing them and utilizing them, they are also of sufficient quality for really good animal gains. When we're thinking about weed suppression, the more cover crop biomass we grow, the better that is. So again, those grass species tend to do the best. The other challenge we really have with a cocktail mixture when we have growing grass and broadleaves is we really limit ourselves on what herbicide tools and that we can use both in the grain crop before the cover crop is grown. So we have to think about herbicide carryover, and it also really limits us for what kind of herbicides we can use ahead of the cover crop. So if we have a straight millet and sorghum sudan, for example, if we're growing that, we have a lot of herbicide tools available to us to help control palmer amaranth and kochia ahead of planting. So that's why our research really hasn't found cocktail mixtures to benefit the system, and also the cost of that. These cocktail mixes are very expensive, and so we want to limit our seed expense per acre. We got to think about how to maximize profitability out of that system, and some of these cocktail mixes can really be very expensive to grow.
Sandy, they've mentioned grazing and forage. How have you seen cattle operations integrate cover crops into their operation?
Well, essentially, this makes a resource that they can, if they can utilize this forage, they're saving something else. And we know that we don't always have the moisture in western Kansas to grow a lot of forage. But when we do, it's kind of like an extra bank account. We can use that forage depending on just what species you put in, what the optimal time is to graze it in relation to the rest of your production cycle. But there's few years when resting some of our native pasture a little longer is not going to be a good thing. And so if it gives you that opportunity to pull off a little earlier, or whatever your system is, maybe you're weaning calves onto it, a higher quality forage, a number of things that producers can utilize that to take advantage of not having to harvest that forage, graze it off. Grazing should leave more residue than if we try to harvest that into a bale. And so it really has some added benefits into the whole system. We're leaving that manure on the field. So many ways to work it in, and just think of it as an extra resource that is available.
If cattle producers are putting their cattle out on those cover crops, do they need to make sure they take into consideration how many cattle that field can handle?
That's right. And, we can't make any blanket statements because our growth can be highly variable. And we do have some tools that can be used to help figure that out. And of course, if you want to put more animals out for a shorter period of time or fewer animals for a longer period of time, there's so much forage that you can take off, and we can do some math to calculate that. So yeah, there's ways that we can do that and adjust that appropriately, but we do want to make sure we're leaving adequate residue to keep that soil covered.
Just to follow up a little bit on what Sandy said is accurate, spot on. But I just want, this is a good year. For example, Western Kansas was, extremely dry, and if we had some cover crop pasture to use, if we had some triticale growing, we could have cattle out on there to rest that native, and so then it would have been best for that native, and now that we've got the rain, it would have come on nice and strong. And the flexibility, just because the Eastern Kansas, we can kind of rely our production. We kind of have is not quite as variable as Western Kansas, so we can kind of have a better idea of how to make that plan for that. Western Kansas, I think that where cover crops have a good fit is because we just don't know what the production is going to be. That we kind of have that cover crop as an insurance buffer, that we have it there to kind of help in those dry years and take some pressure off that native, and take pressure off of having to provide supplemental forage for cattle. And then in the wet years, I'm a big proponent of using that as insurance, and just banking that cover crop. It's always good to have some feed in reserve, in either bale or silage, and we can think about in those years how to set ourselves up for maybe not this year but next year, because we know we just in Western Kansas we're just gonna have to plan on dry years.
Sandy, Augustine, John, I appreciate you all taking the time to join us today.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Shelby, always a pleasure.
That was K-State Cropping Systems and Forage Agronomist John Holman, K-State Soil Scientist Augustine Obour, and K-State Beef Reproduction Specialist Sandy Johnson. If you'd like to read more on this topic, you can do so by checking out a recent Agronomy E-Update article titled Cover Crops Grown Post-Wheat for Forage. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it by going to agronomy.k-state.edu/e-updates. Once again, that is agronomy.k-state.edu/e-updates. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk with this week's Milk Lines.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. As America celebrates 250 years as a nation, K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk looks at how the dairy industry has transformed from localized, labor-intensive family homesteads with a single dairy cow into a high-tech, data-driven sector.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning 250 years of progress in our U.S. dairy industry. If you think about dairy farming 250 years ago, it really consisted of a lot of families with a single cow, and that animal provided milk for individual families. Now we have facilities that might house 50 or 60,000 head of lactating dairy cows. As we think about this, 250 years of progress has come about because of a lot of innovation within our industry. As we look at how our industry's grown, we've grown from these single cow family operations to a global powerhouse of nutrition. It's still a lot of hard work. Yes, it's 24/7 and it's 365 days out of the year, but there's been a lot of innovation and things have changed to maximize our efficiency. When we look at technology, it not only maximizes the efficiency of our dairies, but it also maximizes animal health. Today we have sensors that animals wear that help us monitor their cow health, their activity, nutrition, and all of this is in real time, and many times it's right on the cell phone, so we can keep up to date with what's going on with our dairy animals, regardless of where we might be in the world in relationship to where our cows are actually located. As we think about the green revolution, is the dairy industry part of that? You bet it is. You know, in the last 75 years, we have reduced the carbon footprint by about 2/3 of what it takes to produce a gallon of milk today compared to what it did 75 years ago. So yes, the green revolution is alive and well within our dairy industry. We're producing biogas from the waste products from our dairies, and that is going to help with the overall energy situation here in the United States. As we look at exports, it's a $10 billion export industry out there. We're exporting high-quality protein to a hungry world with sustainable production. As we look at some of the things that we've accomplished in even the last few years, 40 years ago, whey was a disposal problem for our industry. It was a waste product and just simply needed to be disposed of. Today, it's a multi-billion-dollar product we produce across our dairy industry. 10 years ago, when we looked at butterfat content in milk, it averaged about 3.74%. Today, we average 4.32% butterfat. If you would have told me 20 years ago that we were going to see that kind of a change just in 10 years in the butterfat content of milk across our dairy industry, I would have not believed that to be possible. However, with a lot of ingenuity, research, as well as focus on genetics and nutrition, we've been able to accomplish that in our industry. We're also solving some of the issues with the shortage of the meat supply here in the United States. In the last 5 years, we've produced a lot of dairy-crossed calves crossed with beef breeds to provide meat to our meat market in the face of a declining beef cow herd. And we continue to do that, and that has had a huge economic impact on our dairy industry. What's the next 250 years hold for the dairy industry? Well, I would say it'd be a lot of change. There'll be a lot of challenges, but I'm fairly confident that we as producers and researchers will find a way to meet those challenges that come our way, and that we will be able to continue to change and evolve our dairy industry to match what is needed for not only consumers here in the United States, but also consumers around the world. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, celebrating 250 years of progress in our U.S. dairy industry.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.